5, Section 4 deals with territorial expansion which led to compromise. First, we have the Compromise of 1850. Now, before I begin, let's go backwards just a second to the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820. The Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise, outlawed slavery above the 3630 parallel and allowed Missouri to come into the Union as a slave state and Maine to enter the Union as a free state. That retained the balance of free and slave states. The Compromise of 1850, proposed by Henry Clay and subsequently Stephen Douglas, when Henry Clay became too sick to carry it on, also dealt with territories of the United States wanting to become states and dealing with the slavery issue. Here in orange, you can see the states that had already entered the Union as slave states, and purple, states that had come into the Union and had outlawed slavery. And with the success of Americans during the Mexican-American War in 1848, and with the gold rush in 1848, you have a lot of Americans moving westward. And so the Compromise of 1850 was basically 5 parts: that California would come into the Union as a free state, that Utah and New Mexico would vote on the slavery issue, popular sovereignty. The theory is that probably Utah would vote to be a free state and New Mexico would probably vote to be a slave state. That there was some disputed territory between New Mexico and Texas, and this disputed territory, Texas would get paid $10 million for this disputed territory between New Mexico and Texas. And then the South had a problem with the fact that a lot of slaves were escaping into the North, and a lot of the northern states were allowing them to do that illegally. And so a Fugitive Slave Act was passed, which made it illegal for the northern states to harbor escaped slaves. And finally, in the District of Columbia, slavery, or the slave trade, was outlawed. So there were 5 parts to the Compromise of 1850. 1, California. 2, popular sovereignty was used to determine the slavery issue in Utah and New Mexico. 3, Texas was paid a sum of money for disputed territory with New Mexico. 4, the Fugitive Slave Act. And 5, the slave trade was outlawed in the District of Columbia. A second compromise was the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. With the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, 2 new territories had applied for statehood, Kansas and Nebraska. A guy named Stephen Douglas had the idea that we could solve the slavery dispute by letting the people of the territory decide the slavery issue themselves. Theoretically, Nebraska would come in as a free state and Kansas would come in as a slave state, and that would allow to retain an equal number of slave and free states. The problem was people in Missouri, which was a slave state, illegally entered the territory of Kansas and voted in the elections for Kansas to be a slave state when they did not have a legal right to do so. A civil war broke out in Kansas, and Kansas became known as Bleeding Kansas. And a lot of people were injured and killed in Kansas, and this was a very good example of it led to a lot of the distrust between the North and the South. This concludes Unit 5, Section 4, Territorial Expansion, which led to compromise.